Our second scripture this morning comes from the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 14, verses 1 through 14. If you'd like to follow along, it is on page 739 of our pew Bibles. One Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. There in front of him was a man suffering from dropsy. Jesus asked the Pharisees and experts in the law, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But they remained silent. So taking hold of the man, he healed him and sent him away. Then he asked them, "If one of you has a son or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull him out?" And they had nothing to say. When he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, "Give this man your seat." Then, humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. But when you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, "Friend, move up to a better place." Then you will be honored in the presence of all your fellow guests. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Then Jesus said to his host, "When you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. There's a story once about a man who received a promotion to the position of vice president at the company he worked for. The promotion ultimately went to his head, and for weeks on end, he bragged to anyone and everyone that he was now the VP. His bragging came to an abrupt halt when his wife, so embarrassed by his behavior, said, "Listen, Bob, it's not that big of a deal. These days, everyone's a vice president. Why, they even have vice president of peas down at the supermarket." Somewhat deflated, Bob rang the local market to find out if this was true. "Can I speak to the vice president of peas, please?" he asked. To which the reply came, "Fresh or frozen?" At one time or another, we all try to fight for the spotlight. We all want to have the eyes of our friends and family looking at us and standing in awe of us. And at times this does happen, whether you get to the level of vice president or not. But eventually, whether we really want it to or not, something comes along and reminds us to be humble. In our text from the Gospel of Luke this morning, Jesus is eating at the house of a very high-standing Pharisee. And interesting enough, he's there on the Sabbath. Now, a quick reminder about the Sabbath. The Sabbath for the Jewish people is from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. And God commanded the people of Israel to keep the Sabbath holy. And there has been a lot of debate and discussion of what that exactly meant. Now, the Pharisees, who were, if you remember, very high people who were kind of the holy rollers of Jesus' day, took this commandment of keeping the Sabbath holy as the thought that they weren't supposed to do anything on that day. They weren't supposed to do any work. They weren't supposed to lift a finger. And if you did, you violated the law. Well, Jesus challenged the Pharisees' view on the Sabbath on multiple occasions. And so, as Luke comments, the Pharisees have their eyes on Jesus the whole night that he's at this Pharisee's house. We don't know which one, it doesn't matter. But they're wondering, I'm sure, in their minds, what he's going to say, what he's going to comment on, what he's going to challenge them on. And the challenge that Jesus presents on this night comes immediately in verse 2. A man suffering from dropsy arrives. Now, dropsy is a condition of retaining bodily fluids. And if you remember our text from last week, there were people who viewed physical ailments or physical deformities as a result of God's judgment upon the person. Now, Jesus doesn't necessarily claim that that's true. But out of these deformities or calamities or tragedies come the possibility of miracles. And so in verse 3, Jesus takes the initiative and asks the Pharisees and scribes, or maybe we would be better to call them lawyers, and he asks them, is it lawful for him to heal this man on the Sabbath? And they've challenged him before, they've said their piece, but this time they remain silent because maybe they know he's going to do something. And so he does. Jesus then takes the man, maybe by the hand, heals him, and sends him on his way. In verses 5 and 6 of our text, Jesus defends his actions with a very logical argument. He says that if the Pharisees had a child or an ox that happened to fall in the ditch on the road, I mean, they wouldn't just stand by and say, I'll get him tomorrow. No, they wouldn't hesitate to pull out their child or their ox in order to save it. In other words, Jesus is saying, whether it's the Sabbath, whether it's Saturday, whether it's Sunday, whether it's Monday, whether it's any day, it's appropriate to show compassion. And then beginning in verse 7, Jesus notices around the table how certain people have certain places of honor at the Pharisees' table. And this gives him an opportunity to tell a parable. Now, a little context. At an ancient meal, the table was usually kind of in a U shape. And the host, who was supposed to be, the prominent figure at this feast, would sit at the base of the U so that everybody around the U would see the host. And then around the host, going around the U, would be the people going from most important to ultimately at the edges, the least important people. And often the most honored guests would usually arrive a little later, probably so that everybody could see them arrive. The look at me kind of type thing. But Jesus, in his parable, pictures a gathering where there are many honorable people invited. And it may have been a wedding feast. He does say wedding feast. Or it could be any feast in our discussion. And he discusses the fundamental question about how to approach the subject of being honored. According to Jesus, you are not to seek or to assume that you deserve the place right next to the host, the highest seat of honor, because perhaps a more distinguished person could have been assigned to that seat and invited. Kind of the thought of there's always a bigger fish. Well, very possibly there's a higher honored person at the party. And if that's the case, then the host is going to ask you to move. And when you get up, you have to walk around the edge of the table to the top of the U-shaped table to the least important seats. All the while, the people at the feast are watching you as you take your seat in shame. This is because you have assumed more honor for yourself than what others acknowledge. But if you're a wise person, Jesus says, you'll take the least important seat at the top of the table. And so that when the time comes and the host sees that you're at this place, says, come on up, come to the worthy places, come to the better places, come sit by me. Then instead of shame, you walk in honor and glory and approval of all the people. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and for those who humble themselves will be exalted. Jesus then expands the call in verses 12 through 14, saying that we ultimately shouldn't worry about what seats we get as guests at the table, but really we should be concerned about with whom we seek to serve as our guests, taking on our mantle as host. And in a very typical Jesus way, he calls us to serve those who cannot repay our kindness. He says we should not invite our friends. We should not invite our family. We shouldn't even invite the rich neighbor, because they will certainly pay us back. Inviting those types of people is the easiest thing to do for a feast. Rather, he says, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. The best hospitality and grace is that which is given but not exchanged. And then Jesus brings in at the end how even though we give those, we invite those who cannot repay, even though they can't repay us, God will reward us because of our love and grace in the resurrection to come. Jesus praises those who reach out to the needy and ministers to them. If you haven't caught on already, the text we have today revolves around two key themes: humility and generosity. Both are attitudes that are important to our Christian character, and both reflect commitments to be giving in life. As Christians, we are called to give rather than look on how we can receive. And this often runs against our human nature. More often than not, we look for ways where we can better ourselves. We ask questions: how can I achieve more comfort? How can I achieve more things? How can I achieve the good life? We also like to lift up the rich and famous. I know I do at times. Almost a month ago already, the Oscars were on TV, and I don't know, maybe you don't like to watch them, but I find myself in awe as I watch the television where all these celebrities are dressed in all their fancy attire, and ultimately I cheer as really they're giving themselves pats on the backs by handing themselves these statues of gold. I mean, I didn't vote, they're voting for themselves, but I stand in awe of them. Many ministries tend to focus on ministering to those who have the most monetary resources, ultimately with the hope that they will fund their ministries. This isn't necessarily a bad idea, but Jesus tries to teach us to give, and that God doesn't show favoritism to those who have the biggest pocketbooks, but God actually shows kindness and blessings to both the rich and the downtrodden. This is ultimately how God has acted with each of us. While we were still sinners, while we still owed a great debt to God, a debt we could not pay, it is God himself who paid our debt through Jesus' death. God offers each one of us so many blessings and grace and forgiveness free of charge that we are not required to pay back. The question then becomes, shouldn't we do the same with those in our own lives? Another attitude that maybe can result from our tendency to be somewhat self-focused is maybe the idea that the condition of someone's life is ultimately their own problem. For example, the common thought that people are poor because they are lazy. I think it's this kind of thinking that stops us from being compassionate to help such people. Sometimes that may be the case, but maybe we don't realize that there are people out there who have grown up with little to no family support. They have received little to no training or schooling or help from anyone in their lives. Whether we realize it or not, we rely on so many other people for so many things in our lives. No one can do everything alone. We rely on each other so much. That's the whole point of Christian community, is we help each other, we sharpen each other. The same thing in other aspects of life. Ultimately, in humility, we must realize that we need each other, and therefore we should hopefully show compassion to one another, especially to those who are on the fringes of society. Now, it's obvious that this text calls us to be humble and to be generous, but actually developing this kind of humble spirit and living in light of it is sometimes difficult, because it goes against our tendencies to ultimately desire our own honor and praise. We want to be the spotlight at times. It is difficult to not go to a great place, a great feast, and seek to sit at the highest table, let alone sit at the edge of it where nobody knows we're there. Or maybe it's difficult for us to let others take credit for our work, or to pay attention to those who may not be able to give back. It's possibly difficult to praise a coworker when we ourselves want the praise, when we ourselves want the raise and the job promotion to vice president. But let's be clear. I want to make this very clear that Jesus does not speak against all honor here. There is an appropriate time and place to receive praise from others and from God. But such glory and honor and praise should not be sought after. It should hopefully come with a job well done. Therefore, I hope we ask ourselves, do we seek attention? Or do we act in humbleness, in compassion upon those who cannot repay us back with money or kindness or status? A good test is to think of the activities that we engage in that are ultimately outwardly directed towards others, rather than activities that are self-serving. And I think this is a great test for our church as well. Where do we use our time and resources? Where do we use those? Where do we put them? Because they ultimately show where we are focused. A July 2017 Indianapolis Star article outlines a wonderful story about a woman and her fiancé who were engaged to be married. But a week before the wedding, the bride-to-be called the wedding off. She didn't say why, but she called it off. And so the woman called the venue where the reception was to be held. It was called the Ritz Charles outside of Indianapolis, to see about a refund. But the Ritz told her that she had signed a non-refundable contract for a dinner for 170 guests. The woman was devastated, and she called all her guests. She apologized, she cried, she called the vendor, she cried some more, and she felt horrible that she was about to throw all this food away. And that's when she got the idea. She worked with the venue and an event planner, and she rearranged the reception area. And then she called all the homeless shelters in and around Indianapolis. and invited all the homeless to her once wedding party. The woman arranged for 2 buses to pick up shelter residents and families and bring them to the venue. And of course, what really struck me was the menu. And the menu was quite fancy. It included bourbon glazed meatballs, goat cheese and roasted garlic bruschetta, chicken breast with artichokes and Chardonnay cream sauce, and of course, wedding cake. When it was all said and done, the former couple had thrown a $30,000 worth extravaganza and turned it to feed and entertain people who could not pay her back. While this may be an extraordinary example, while we may not always be able to throw this type of party, I think the principle is still valid. We are all people who have benefited from God's grace freely. Therefore, we should know what it feels like to receive when we cannot repay. This is why we are called to be givers in return. We should understand that we give not to get, but we give out of gratitude because God has given us so much. This is the kind of ministry and attitude that Jesus calls us today. As God has given us so much, may we give to those around us. Amen.